The lunar summit had transformed the compound into a warren of scents, voices, and territorial posturing that made Vesper's teeth ache even before she slipped past the first perimeter. 7 territories, 7 alphas, all gathered under Dominic Harrow's roof, with their entourages and their barely concealed contempt for one another, which meant security focused outward on threats between rivals rather than inward on a single rogue who had learned, through 5 years of bitter study, how to make herself invisible. The blood magic required for the masking spell had cost her, a thin line carved into her forearm that morning, still weeping beneath the black tactical fabric, but pain was a currency she'd grown comfortable spending. She moved through the eastern wing, where the ventilation shafts opened into the old archive sections, spaces the renovated compound had built over but not filled, and dropped into darkness that smelled of concrete dust and decades-old paper. Her mother's grimoire had contained a map, sketched in margins beside incantations that should have been impossible for a shifter to perform, and Vesper had long since stopped questioning how her mother had known the compound's layout so intimately. The dead kept their secrets, and the living learned to navigate by their breadcrumbs. The Vault of Ancients sat 3 levels below the main structure, behind doors that responded to alpha dominance rather than keys, which should have made it inaccessible to someone whose wolf had been dormant since adolescence. Should have. Vesper pressed her palm to the steel and whispered the words her mother had written in a language that predated pack law, felt the magic drain from her blood into the metal, and watched the door recognize her into something other, something old enough that the wards could not categorize and therefore could not reject. Inside, the crown rested on an altar of black stone that seemed to absorb the dim emergency lighting. It was smaller than she'd imagined, a circlet of dark metal inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at directly, and when I lifted it, the weight felt wrong, too heavy and too light simultaneously, as though it existed partially in another space. She'd expected alarms, guards, some indication that she'd triggered the compound's defenses, but there was only silence and the sound of her own breathing, and the crown cold against her palms. The power would come when she wore it. The power would come and she would unmake everything the kings had built, every law that had condemned her family, every system that had taken her brother and returned his body, 12 years old and broken. Except they hadn't returned him at all, had they? They told her he was dead, showed her ashes that could have been anyone's, anything's, and she'd believed because she'd been 15 and drowning and had nothing left but belief. Vesper placed the crown on her head and waited for the transformation, for the surge of dominance that would let her tear apart pack bonds and hierarchies and the very concept of alpha kings. Nothing happened. The metal sat against her skull, inert and hollow, a shell without substance, and her wolf remained dormant, and in the spreading cold of realization she understood that she'd miscalculated something fundamental. "The crown is simply a key," Dominic Harrow said from behind her, his voice carrying that particular resonance that made electronics flicker and weaker shifters drop their eyes. Useless without the lock it was designed to open. She spun, hands already moving through the gestures for a bloodworking that would buy her seconds at most, and found him alone in the doorway, tall enough that he had to angle slightly to fit the frame, his golden eyes catching the light with those strange silver flecks that marked him as something more than an ordinary alpha. He wasn't wearing the formal attire she'd seen in surveillance photos, just dark pants and a shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing the tattoo-like markings. Kings that wrapped his forearms, pack bonds made visible through proximity to whatever power he carried. "I've been tracking you for 7 months, he continued, moving into the vault with the unhurried confidence of someone who controlled every variable. "Since you killed those enforcers in the border territories, using magic that shouldn't exist in shifter bloodlines. Since you started asking questions about the crown in places where those questions would eventually reach my ears. Did you think I wouldn't be curious about a rogue who could perform blood workings?" Vesper's magic coiled beneath her skin, ready to strike. But she'd researched him as thoroughly as he'd apparently researched her. And she knew that attacking the Alpha King in his own territory while he stood within arm's reach would end with her dead before the spell left her lips. "You let me get this far. You wanted me to reach the crown. I wanted to see what you'd do with it." He stopped 3 feet away, close enough that his presence pressed against her senses like a physical weight. And she felt her dormant wolf stir for the first time in over a decade. A flutter of awareness that bordered on recognition. "Impossible. And I wanted to offer you a choice. There's a traitor in my inner circle, someone who's been destabilizing pack bonds across multiple territories, using methods that suggest magical manipulation. Help me identify them and I'll give you access to the power you're seeking." "Why would I help you?"
The words came out steadier than she felt, while her wolf continued its agitation beneath her skin, responding to his proximity in ways that shouldn't be possible for a broken shifter. Because the alternative is execution for theft, murder of pack enforcers, and use of forbidden magic. He raised his hand and she tensed, but he only gestured to his own chest, to the space above his heart. And because I'm going to place a compulsion mark on you that will kill you if you travel beyond a certain distance from me. You'll remain in the compound. You'll use those abilities to help me find who's undermining my territories. And when it's done, we'll discuss what you really came here seeking. You don't know what I'm seeking. Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the controlled mask that suggested weariness beneath the dominance. You're seeking revenge against a system that destroyed your family. I understand that motivation more intimately than you might expect. Before she could respond, he moved, faster than she could track, and pressed his palm over her heart. The magic that flooded through her was nothing like her own blood workings, all sharp edges and burning cold, and she felt it sink into her chest like a brand, creating a tether that stretched between them. When he stepped back, the connection remained, a constant awareness of his location relative to hers, and the implicit threat of what would happen if that distance grew too great. You'll be given quarters in the King's Wing, Dominic said, retrieving the crown from where it had fallen during the marking. Consider yourself my consultant, or my prisoner. The distinction is largely semantic. Vesper wanted to spit defiance, to tell him she'd find a way to break his compulsion and finish what she'd started. But her wolf was still stirring, still responding to his presence with that inexplicable recognition. And beneath her fury was a cold tactical assessment. She was still alive, still inside the compound. And now she'd have access to resources and information she could never have obtained as a rogue. What did you mean? She asked as he turned to leave. About the crown being a key. He paused in the doorway, his profile sharp against the corridor light beyond. I meant that power doesn't reside in objects, Vesper Crane. It resides in bonds, in connections between living vessels. The crown is merely a tool for manipulating those connections. You could never have used it because you have no bond to the source it was designed
to access. His eyes met hers, and there was something almost like sympathy in their amber depths. Your family understood that. It's why they tried to run. Then he was gone, and she was alone with the aftermath of her failed theft and the burning mark above her heart, and the terrible suspicion that she'd walked into something far more complex than a simple heist. Her brother's face rose in her memory, 12 years old and laughing before everything fell apart, and she pressed her hand to the compulsion mark and promised him, as she had promised his memory every day for 12 years, that she would tear down the system that had destroyed them, even if she had to do it from inside the king's own walls. The suite they assigned her occupied the 3rd floor of the King's Wing, close enough to Dominic's private quarters that the compulsion mark remained a dull warmth rather than an active burn, and Vesper understood immediately that proximity was part of the imprisonment. The rooms were elegant in an austere way, all clean lines and neutral colors that suggested wealth without ostentation, and the windows, she discovered within her first hour, were reinforced with silver mesh embedded in the glass, not to keep intruders out, to keep her in. She'd been given 2 days to acclimate before Dominic summoned her to the first inner circle meeting, 2 days spent exploring the limits of her confinement and discovering that guards tracked her movements with the efficiency of a well-oiled surveillance system. The compound's library became her refuge, its archives containing histories of the territory system that her mother's grimoire had only hinted at, and it was there, surrounded by records of past Alpha Kings and their rise to power, that she began to understand the depth of the structure she'd intended to dismantle. The meeting took place in a conference room that managed to feel both modern and ancient, its table a single slab of dark wood that predated the building around it. Dominic sat at the head, his presence filling the space in that way she was beginning to recognize as constant rather than performed, and arrayed around him were the faces she'd studied in surveillance photos, but never expected to meet as something other than obstacles. Felix Thorne occupied the seat to Dominic's right, sandy-haired and green-eyed, with a build that suggested he'd been a fighter before becoming Beta, and the hostility in his expression when Vesper entered made her earlier assessment of him as loyal enforcer solidify into certainty. "You're bringing a rogue into strategic discussions?" he said, not bothering to frame it as a question. "I'm bringing a specialist in magical manipulation into discussions about magical manipulation of pack bonds." Dominic's tone allowed no argument. Vesper has unique qualifications for identifying the kind of interference we've been experiencing.
Across the table, Vivian Cross smiled with the kind of warmth that seemed genuine, until Vesper looked closer and saw the assessment happening behind those golden eyes. She was beautiful in a commanding way, her business attire immaculate, silver threads woven through her braided hair catching the light when she moved. "Welcome, Vesper. I've heard fascinating things about your abilities. It's not often we encounter shifters with your particular combination of talents." Something in the phrasing made Vesper's instincts prickle, but before she could analyze the sensation, Vivian was continuing, her voice pitched to include the whole room. "I should mention, for context, that I serve as the king's chief advisor and primary ritualist. I manage the official bonding ceremonies and territorial wards, so if you have questions about the magical infrastructure of our systems, I'm happy to provide background." A ritualist. The designation explained the silver threads, the formal bearing, the way she spoke about magic as administration rather than art. Vesper filed the information away, noting how it positioned Vivian as the magical authority in the room, which made Vesper herself either a threat to that authority or a potential asset, depending on how the politics played. The meeting progressed through reports of destabilized bonds in 3 outlying territories, patterns of aggression among pack members who should have been anchored by their alpha's dominance, and Vesper listened while pretending not to notice how often Felix's attention returned to her with suspicion. When Dominic finally asked for her assessment, she chose her words carefully, letting her expertise show without revealing the full extent of what her mother's grimoire had taught her. "Bond destabilization of this kind requires intimate knowledge of pack structure," she said, tracing invisible patterns on the table's surface as though visualizing the magical architecture. "Whoever is doing this understands not just how bonds form, but how they can be corroded from within. It's not an external attack. It's more like introducing a slow poison into the connection itself." Vivian leaned forward slightly, her interest apparent. "You're suggesting someone with access to the bonds themselves, someone who participates in the official structure, or someone who's found a way to mimic that access." Vesper met the ritualist's eyes, watching for reactions. Blood magic can forge connections that resemble legitimate bonds closely enough to fool casual observation. The question is whether your wards would detect that kind of intrusion. "They should," Vivian said, but there was a thread of uncertainty in her voice that felt deliberate, as though she was inviting Vesper to challenge the assertion. "But magical systems can be circumvented by someone with sufficient knowledge and motivation." The discussion continued for another hour, technical enough that Vesper suspected it was partially a test of her claimed expertise, and when Dominic finally dismissed the group, Vivian lingered, approaching Vesper with the kind of casual intimacy that suggested friendship rather than professional courtesy. "That must have been difficult," she said quietly, being introduced as the rogue with forbidden abilities. "Felix isn't usually so hostile, but he takes threats to Dominic very personally." She glanced toward the door where the beta had exited. "For what it's worth, I think your perspective could be valuable. The traditional approaches clearly aren't working." It was an offer of alliance, or at least the appearance of one, and Vesper recognized the political maneuver, even as part of her responded to the simple fact of someone treating her as colleague rather than prisoner. "I appreciate that. I'm still learning the dynamics here. If you need anything, my office is on the 2nd floor. I mean that genuinely." Vivian's smile reached her eyes this time, or seemed to. "We're not all convinced that unconventional methods are dangerous. Some of us think they might be necessary." After she left, Vesper stood alone in the conference room, studying the table's ancient wood and feeling the weight of observation even in apparent solitude. Everyone here wore multiple faces, herself included, and trust was a commodity in shorter supply than power. The pack hunt happened 4 days into her captivity, announced with the kind of casual inevitability that refusal impossible. Dominic found her in the library and delivered the news with his characteristic directness. "Tonight the inner circle runs the northern boundary. You'll participate. Consider it a demonstration of your commitment to cooperation." "I can't shift," Vesper said, the lie coming easily after years of practice. "My wolf has been dormant since I was 15. "Then you'll run on 2 legs and keep up as best you can." His expression suggested he knew exactly what he was asking, forcing her into a situation where her limitations would be exposed before the same people she was supposed to be working alongside. "Unless you'd prefer to refuse, in which case we can discuss alternative Vesper arrangements for your confinement." She went, of course, because the alternative was admitting weakness, and when they gathered at the forest edge as sunset stained the sky crimson, she felt the familiar anxiety of anticipated failure mixing with something newer, a stirring in her chest that her wolf responded to the proximity of so many shifted forms. Felix transformed first, his change smooth and practiced, followed by the other senior pack members, until only she and Dominic remained in human form. "Whenever you're ready," he said, and the words carried weight beyond their surface meaning, as though he was testing for something specific. Vesper reached for her wolf, for the part of herself that had been silent and still for so long she'd half believed it dead, and felt it rise sluggishly, reluctantly, like a limb gone numb from disuse. The transformation started, bones beginning their shift, but instead of the smooth transition she saw in others, her body caught halfway, suspended between forms in a configuration that sent pain screaming through every nerve. Her hands became claws, her jaw extended with fangs. Her eyes, she knew without seeing, had shifted to wolf amber, but her body remained essentially human, covered in a sheen of sweat and trembling with the effort of maintaining even this incomplete state. And beneath her skin, visible through the thin fabric of her shirt, the scars on her arms began to glow with pale light, blood magic markings responding to the attempted transformation, creating a visual display that no pure shifter could produce. The watching pack members went still, that particular stillness that preceded either violence or retreat, and she heard someone whisper the word abomination with the kind of conviction that came from deep-seated belief. Felix stepped forward in his wolf form, lips pulled back from teeth in what could have been threat or disgust, and Vesper forced herself to hold his gaze despite the pain still radiating through her partial transformation. But before the confrontation could escalate, Dominic moved between them, still human, his presence alone enough to make the beta back down. "She's hybrid," Dominic said, addressing the group with the same matter-of-fact tone he might use for weather reports. "Witch and wolf. That's why her abilities are effective against magical interference. That's why she's here." He looked at Vesper, and in his eyes she saw not revulsion but something closer to recognition. "Run as you are. The hunt doesn't require 4 legs." So she ran, her body caught in its agonizing in-between state, and discovered that hybrid form had its own advantages, speed and strength beyond human, but retaining human tactical thinking. And when she brought down the target, a marked deer released for the hunt's purpose, she felt her wolf finally settle into something like contentment, as though it had been waiting years for permission to exist imperfectly. Later, returned to the compound with her body aching and her secret exposed, Vesper stood in her suite's bathroom and studied her reflection, the scars on her arms still faintly luminescent, her face carrying traces of the wolf that wouldn't fully emerge. She'd come here to steal power, but what she'd revealed instead was the truth of what she was, and in Dominic's eyes during that moment of recognition, she'd seen something that terrified her more than hostility. She'd seen understanding, as though he knew exactly what it cost to be something other than what the world expected, and the compulsion mark above her heart pulsed with warmth that had nothing to do with magical enforcement, and everything to do with a connection she hadn't anticipated and couldn't afford. The poisoning happened during a council meeting on the 8th day of her confinement, sudden and vicious enough that Vesper understood immediately this was no ordinary attempt on Dominic's life. He'd been speaking, his voice carrying that resonant authority she'd grown accustomed to, when he stopped mid-sentence.
His hand moving to his chest where the pack bonds manifested visibly on his skin. The markings, usually dark and steady, began to writhe like living things in pain, and the color drained from his face with the speed of a wound opening. Felix moved first, catching Dominic as his legs buckled, and the room erupted into controlled chaos, guards flooding in while the council members pressed back against the walls, with the instinct of people who understood that proximity to a threatened alpha king was its own form of danger. Vesper felt the compulsion mark above her heart constrict, responding to Dominic's distress with sympathetic pain, and she pushed through the crowd with the kind of single-minded focus that made people move aside without conscious decision. "It's suppressing his bond to the sovereign shadow," she said, kneeling beside where Felix had lowered Dominic to the floor, and she could see it happening, the way the markings on his skin were fading, the connection to whatever power he carried being systematically severed. "Can you stop it?" Felix demanded, his hostility toward her temporarily overridden by desperate pragmatism, and Vesper was already pulling a small knife from her boot, the blade she kept for blood workings too small to be classified as a weapon by the guards who'd searched her. "I can stabilize him. I can't cure him." She drew the blade across her palm, let her blood well dark and potent with the magic she'd been hoarding, and pressed her bleeding hand to Dominic's chest, where the bond markings were nearly invisible now. The working she performed was improvisation and instinct, using her own hybrid nature as a bridge, her magic reaching into his system and wrapping around the poison like a cage, containing it without eliminating it. She felt his wolf, massive and golden and currently drowning, and she felt something else, something vast and ancient that existed beneath the wolf, a presence that regarded her with inhuman curiosity before accepting her temporary support. Dominic's eyes opened, amber with silver flecks, but dimmer than they should be,
and he looked at her with an expression she couldn't decipher. His lips moved, forming words barely audible beneath the concerned voices surrounding them. They took the wrong child. Then he lost consciousness, and the healers were pushing her aside, and Felix was gripping her shoulder with enough force to bruise, his voice low and dangerous in her ear. If you had anything to do with this, if this is part of whatever game you're playing, I will kill you myself, mark or no mark. I just saved his life, Vesper said, pulling free and standing on legs that trembled with exhaustion and magic depletion. And whoever did this had intimate knowledge of how the king's bond works. That should narrow your suspect list considerably. Vivian appeared at her elbow, her composure intact despite the crisis, and guided Vesper away from the cluster of people surrounding Dominic with the firm gentleness of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. You need to clean that hand before infection sets in. Come on, my office has proper supplies. In Vivian's immaculate second-floor office, surrounded by ritual implements and reference texts that spoke to decades of study, Vesper sat while the ritualist cleaned and bandaged her self-inflicted wound with practiced efficiency. That was remarkable work, Vivian said quietly. Blood magic used to support rather than attack. I've never seen that application before. My mother taught me that magic is a tool, not inherently good or destructive. It depends on the wielder's intent. Vesper watched Vivian's hands, noting the steadiness, the silver rings on 3 fingers that probably served magical functions. You said you managed the official bond ceremonies. Does that mean you understand how the king's bond to the sovereign shadow functions? In theory. Vivian secured the bandage and sat back, her expression thoughtful. The sovereign shadow is an ancestral spirit that passes from one alpha king to the next, granting them the power to maintain dominance over all territories. The bond is formed through a ritual that requires the crown as a focusing tool and the willing acceptance of the vessel. But the deeper mechanics, how the spirit actually integrates with the king's wolf, that's knowledge that died with the original ritualists centuries ago. So someone who wanted to attack that bond would need access to very old, very specific information. Or they'd need to experiment, which would mean previous attempts that might have gone unnoticed if they were subtle enough. Vivian's eyes met Vesper's, and there was something searching in her gaze. You stabilized him by creating a bridge with your own hybrid nature. That suggests the poison was designed to exploit the separation between the king's wolf and the shadow, attacking the point where they connect. It was an astute analysis, and Vesper felt a grudging respect for the other woman's magical understanding, which means whoever created the poison understands that connection well enough to target its vulnerabilities. That's not common knowledge. No, Vivian agreed softly. It's not. They released Vesper back to her suite with instructions to rest, but sleep felt impossible with her mind churning through implications and the compulsion mark providing constant updates on Dominic's condition, a warmth that fluctuated with concerning irregularity. Instead, she made her way to the compound's archives, the public section she'd explored before, and began searching for information about the Sovereign Shadow with new urgency. The oldest records described it not as a weapon or tool of dominance, but as something called the Guardian Pact, an agreement between the first shifter communities and a protective spirit that would help them defend against external threats. The language was formal, almost contractual, speaking of mutual benefit and willing partnership. But as the records progressed through centuries, the terminology shifted, became more possessive, more focused on power and control. By the time she reached documents from 50 years ago, the shadow was referred to exclusively as the king's power, the royal dominion, as though it had transformed from guardian to possession, or as though the kings had transformed how they used it. She found references to children brought to the compound during various reigns, always carefully worded, always justified as protective custody or educational opportunity, but the pattern was clear enough when she knew to look for it. Young shifters with specific qualities, held for months or years before being released, or in some cases, simply disappearing from the records entirely. No names, just identification numbers and brief notes about genetic markers and compatibility assessments. Vesper's hands shook as she turned pages, searching for anything from 12 years ago, from the period when her family was exiled and her brother supposedly killed. But those records were missing, gaps in the archive that felt deliberate rather than accidental. Someone had removed specific years, and she suspected she knew which ones. The period surrounding Dominic's violent ascension to power, when his father was assassinated and everything fell into chaos. When she finally returned to her suite, dawn was breaking and exhaustion made her movements clumsy. She found Dominic sitting in her living area, looking pale but upright, the bandage on his chest visible where his shirt hung open. The compulsion mark had settled into steady warmth, confirming what her eyes told her, that he'd survived and stabilized. "You should be in medical," she said, closing the door behind her, and resisting the urge to check his vital signs like a concerned healer rather than a prisoner playing consultant. I needed to ask you something away from witnesses and listening devices.
His voice was rougher than usual, strained by whatever the poison had done to him. When you stabilized me, what did you feel? What did you sense beneath the bond? Vesper moved to the chair across from him, maintaining distance while her instincts pulled her closer, wanting to verify his recovery with her own hands. I felt your wolf, and I felt something else, something vast that was observing me, the sovereign shadow. And what did it communicate? Curiosity, recognition maybe, like it saw my hybrid nature and found it interesting. She studied his face, the exhaustion there and something deeper, a weariness that went beyond physical. You said something while you were unconscious. You said they took the wrong child. Dominic closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, the amber seemed darker, as though he was looking at her from behind a veil. I was delirious from the poison. I don't remember saying anything. It was a lie, transparent enough that he had to know she'd recognize it as such, which meant he wanted her to know he was choosing not to answer rather than being ignorant. Why did you really let me get as far as the crown? You could have stopped me at any point during my infiltration. Because I've been king for 15 years, and in that time I've watched the system I'm supposed to uphold destroy families, crush territories under unsustainable dominance, and warp the very purpose the sovereign shadow was meant to serve. He leaned forward, his intensity cutting through his exhaustion. You came here to tear it all down. Part of me wanted to see if you could succeed. The admission hung between them, dangerous and honest, and Vesper felt something shift in her understanding of the man who held her prisoner. And now? Now someone just tried to kill me using knowledge that should be restricted to maybe 3 people in this compound. Now I'm beginning to think the corruption goes deeper than territorial disputes and bond destabilization. He stood, moving carefully, and headed for the door. Rest. When I'm recovered enough to travel, we're going to the mountain territories to investigate the attacks there. You'll come with me. The compulsion mark, Vesper said, stopping him at the threshold. Yes. So if something happened to you, if the poisoning had succeeded, what would have happened to me? Dominic looked back at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, his expression was entirely unguarded. The mark would have killed you within hours of my death. That's how compulsion bonds work. Your life is tied to mine now, which means whoever is trying to eliminate me is also trying to eliminate you. He left before she could respond, and Vesper sat in the growing morning light, her bandaged hand throbbing and her mind turning over everything she'd learned. The sovereign shadow as guardian rather than weapon, children taken and assessed, her brother's name somewhere in missing records, and Dominic, the Alpha King who questioned his own authority, whose life was now entangled with hers through magic and political necessity. She'd come to steal power, but what she was discovering instead was a web of secrets and corruption that suggested the real theft had happened generations ago, when someone transformed a protective pact into a tool of dominance, and every king since had inherited both the power and the crime. The mountain territories existed in a different temporal space than the compound, places where shifter communities still lived according to older patterns, their homes built into cliffsides, and their pack structures organized around extended family units rather than strict hierarchical chains. Vesper felt the change as soon as they crossed into the northern reaches, the air sharper and the bond networks looser, more organic, and she understood why Dominic had insisted she accompany him despite his advisor's protests about bringing the hybrid rogue into vulnerable territories.
He needed someone whose magic could track the interference patterns, and she needed access to records that might exist outside the compound's sanitized archives. They traveled with a small security detail, Felix among them maintaining his suspicious vigilance, and reached the primary settlement, a cluster of buildings carved partially into the mountainside itself, just as reports came in of movement in the eastern valley. Rogues, armed with weapons that the scouts described in tones of confusion, metallic devices that hummed with energy that felt wrong against shifter senses. The attack came during what should have been a peaceful challenge ritual, a young shifter proving himself ready for adult status before his pack, and Vesper watched the ceremony from the settlement's central platform alongside Dominic when the first explosion tore through the gathering space below. Not fire or conventional explosives, but something that disrupted pack bonds directly, severing connections with enough force that shifters dropped mid-transformation, their wolves torn away by invisible violence. Dominic moved immediately, his weakened state from the poisoning not enough to slow the trained response of someone who'd been fighting territorial threats for 15 years, and Vesper found herself following, her hybrid form emerging more smoothly than it had during the hunt, her body finally learning the rhythm of incomplete transformation. The rogues numbered perhaps 20, massed and coordinated, wielding devices that looked like technological graphs onto magical frameworks, abominations of engineering and ritual work that should not have been possible.
She killed the first one who came at her with claws and blood magic combined, tearing through his defenses and feeling his life end with the detached efficiency she'd learned during 5 years of surviving as a rogue, and moved on to the next while around her pack warriors engaged in desperate combat. Felix fought 3 rogues simultaneously, his wolf form massive and golden brown, and when one of the devices discharged directly into his chest, sending him sprawling with his bond temporarily severed from his alpha, Vesper was there, her magic wrapping around his connection and holding it intact through sheer force of will until the effect dissipated. The beta looked at her with something that was no longer entirely hostility, a grudging acknowledgement of debt, before launching himself back into the fight. Dominic fought at the center of the chaos, his presence drawing attackers like a lodestone, and even weakened he was devastating, his alpha dominance a physical force that made rogues hesitate fatally before engaging. But Vesper could see the strain, the way the Sovereign Shadow's power flickered inconsistently, and she understood with cold certainty that whoever had poisoned him had timed these attacks to exploit his vulnerability. She performed a tracking ritual in the middle of combat, her blood painting symbols on stone while her hybrid senses kept watch for threats, and felt the signatures of the weapons lead back to a single source, a magical anchor point somewhere in the compound itself. These attacks were not independent rogue actions, but coordinated strikes designed to sever Dominic's connection to his territorial bonds, the network of allegiances that fed power to the Sovereign Shadow and maintained his position as king. "They're trying to isolate you," she shouted to Dominic across the fighting, cutting your bonds territory by territory until the Shadow has nothing to anchor to. His response was to tear through 2 rogues with enough violence that the others began to retreat, their coordination breaking under the reality of facing an alpha king even at diminished capacity. And within minutes the attack dissolved into scattered flight, leaving behind bodies and the strange weapons that sparked and died as their wielders fell. The aftermath took hours to manage, healers working on injured pack members while Dominic spoke
with the territory leaders in the low tones of someone delivering both reassurance and uncomfortable truth. Vesper examined the weapons, her magical senses parsing their construction, and confirmed what she'd suspected. They were hybrid creations, ritualist magic bound into technological frameworks, requiring knowledge of both disciplines that should have been impossible to combine, unless someone had been studying the intersection of magic and shifter bonds for years, experimenting until they found methods that worked. They sheltered that night in the Mountain Stronghold's guest quarters, separate buildings that still maintained the old tradition of communal sleeping spaces, though Dominic and Vesper were given a private room in deference to his status. She found him on the balcony as moonlight painted the valley silver, his shirt removed to let the healer's work on his chest breathe, and the bond markings visible against his bronze skin were noticeably fainter than they'd been even that morning. "You're deteriorating faster than you're admitting," Vesper said, joining him at the railing, and keeping her voice low enough that it wouldn't carry to the guards positioned at respectful distances. "The poison did more damage than we initially assessed, and these attacks, each one severs more territorial bonds, weakens the network that sustains the Sovereign Shadow's integration." He didn't look at her, his attention on the valley below, where lights marked the settlement's perimeter. "At this rate, I have perhaps 3 weeks before the separation becomes permanent. After that, the Shadow will seek a new vessel, and the power transition without proper ritual tends to be catastrophic." "You mean it will kill you and potentially everyone bonded to you when it tears free?" "Yes." Vesper processed this with the part of her mind that had learned to perform tactical assessment even in crisis, weighing variables and potential outcomes. "The compulsion mark ties my life to yours. You could have mentioned that your timeline is measured in weeks rather than months. Would it have changed your actions?" Now he did look at her, and in the moonlight his eyes seemed more silver than amber, the Sovereign Shadow visible beneath the surface. "You saved Felix today. You've been helping track the conspiracy, despite having every reason to let it succeed and achieve your original goal of destroying the King system. My original goal was predicated on the assumption that the system was uniformly corrupt, and you were a tyrant maintaining it through force." She met his gaze, refusing to look away from the intensity there. "That assessment has become more complicated, because you've discovered I'm just a man trapped in a role I never wanted, maintaining a power structure I've grown to despise, because the alternative is chaos that would kill thousands." His voice carried bitter self-awareness. "How disappointing for you." "Because I've discovered the Sovereign Shadow was never meant to be used the way it has been, because someone corrupted a Guardian Pact into a domination tool, and every king since has inherited that corruption without understanding what was lost." She touched the compulsion mark above her heart, feeling its warmth and the connection it represented. "You said during the poisoning that they took the wrong child. What did you mean?" Dominic was quiet for long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer, the mountain wind cold against her skin and carrying the scent of pine and stone. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and careful, each word chosen with precision. "When I was 17, just before my father's assassination, there were other candidates being evaluated as potential vessels for the Shadow. The ritual allows for preparation, for identifying compatible hosts in case of emergency transition. I wasn't supposed to be chosen. I was too volatile, too resistant to authority. Everything the counselor said made me unsuitable. He turned fully toward her, and she saw
old pain beneath the practiced control. But when my father died mid-ritual, the shadow reached for the nearest compatible vessel and found me. The other candidates, the ones who'd been carefully prepared and assessed, were released, sent away. I've spent 15 years wondering if one of them would have been better suited, less damaged by the integration. You think my brother was one of those candidates. I think your family was destroyed because your mother discovered that the candidate assessment process involved taking children from their homes, marking them magically, and keeping them available for potential use. I think she tried to break those marks, to protect her children from being used as vessels. And I think when my father discovered what she'd done, he exiled your family to cover up the practice. His expression was bleak with guilt and old anger. I freed everyone I found in holding when I took power. I have records of releases, including a boy matching your brother's description, freed at 16 8 years ago. But I don't have records of where they went afterward, and I've begun to suspect those records were deliberately purged. Vesper felt cold that had nothing to do with the mountain air, her mind racing through implications and timelines. Someone who knew about the candidate program, who had access to those children, who might have kept at least one of them for their own purposes. Someone who understands the King's Bond intimately enough to create weapons that attack it specifically. Someone who's been inside the power structure long enough to manipulate it systematically. Dominic's hands gripped the railing with enough force that the wood creaked. I've been trying to identify the traitor by investigating current events. But what if the conspiracy goes back further? What if it started during my father's reign or before? Then we need to look at who had power then and maintained it through your transition, who survived the chaos of your ascension and positioned themselves as indispensable. Vesper's tactical mind was already sorting through possibilities, filtering for individuals who matched the criteria. Someone you trust implicitly because they helped you when you were most vulnerable. They stood in silence after that, both understanding the implications, both reluctant to voice suspicions without evidence. Below them, the settlement continued its recovery, pack bonds were forming and healers working through the night. And Vesper felt the strange duality of her situation with sharp clarity. She was prisoner and consultant, enemy and unexpected ally, her life bound to a man she'd intended to destroy, and now found herself trying to save. The compulsion mark pulsed warm above her heart, but beside it she felt something else developing, a connection that had nothing to do with magical enforcement, and everything to do with recognition, with seeing another person trapped in circumstances beyond their control, and choosing resistance over resignation. When we returned to the compound, Dominic said finally, "I'm giving you access to my personal archives, everything I've kept separate from official records. If there's evidence of who's behind this, it will be there. That's a significant amount of trust to place in someone who tried to steal your crown 2 weeks ago. You've had multiple opportunities to let me die. You've chosen otherwise." He looked at her with something that might have been the beginning of trust, fragile and uncertain. "And if we're both going to survive the next 3 weeks, we need to stop pretending we're still enemies." Vesper nodded, accepting the logic even as part of her recognized the danger of letting this man become anything other than a means to an end. But her brother was alive somewhere. The system she'd blamed was more complex than she'd understood. And the Alpha King she'd intended to destroy was offering partnership instead of dominance. She'd come to the mountains expecting battle. What she'd found instead
was the beginning of transformation, both of herself and of her understanding of what power meant and who deserved to wield it. Dominic's personal archives occupied a sealed room in the king's private wing, behind wards that recognized his blood signature, and after he modified them with a ritual that Vesper's magical senses ache with its complexity, hers as well. The space was smaller than she'd expected, lined with filing cabinets and storage boxes that spoke to 15 years of accumulated secrets. And when he left her there with instructions to search for anything related to the candidate program or her family, she felt the weight of trust that gesture represented. She started with the oldest materials, documents from his father's reign that Dominic had preserved despite their association with a man he'd clearly held complicated feelings toward. Financial records, territorial agreements, correspondence with other alphas, all the mundane administration of running a multi-territory kingdom, and varied within them references to a program called Project Continuity that made her hands shake when she finally understood its scope. Children identified through genetic screening, brought to the compound under various pretenses, held in what the documents euphemistically called protective education, while they were assessed for compatibility with the sovereign shadow. Some were released after months, deemed unsuitable. Others remained for years. A few simply disappeared from the records, their files marked with a red notation that meant transfer to deep archive, which seemed to be code for something far more sinister. Vesper found the records from 12 years ago in a box marked with her family name, and seeing it written in official documentation, Crane, Margaret Crane and her children, made the past suddenly visceral in a way memory alone could not achieve. Her mother had been investigated for suspicious magical activity, for performing workings that suggested knowledge of blood magic that shifters should not possess. The investigating officer's notes described her as uncooperative, defensive about her children, and potentially dangerous to pack stability. The recommendation was exile, but there was a handwritten addendum in a script she didn't recognize. Suggest retrieval of male child, age 12, shows compatibility markers. Female child, age 15, presents complications, possible hybrid characteristics. Recommend observation but not acquisition. They'd wanted Tobias. They'd exiled the family to separate him from their mother's protection, and then they'd taken him, and the official report listed him as deceased during an enforcement action that supposedly turned violent. But clipped to that report was a second document, this one dated 8 years ago and signed by Dominic himself, ordering the release of all remaining candidates from Project Continuity, including Subject 773, male, age 16, remanded to Territorial Rehabilitation Program. Subject 773 had been her brother, kept for 4 years in whatever deep archive meant, and then released into a program that apparently no longer kept records, because when Vesper searched for any mention of territorial rehabilitation, she found only a reference to a defunct initiative that had been dissolved 9 years ago due to budget constraints. Someone had taken the children Dominic released and made them disappear all over again. She was still processing this, her mind cycling through implications and her grief a physical pressure in her chest, when she found the second revelation, buried in correspondence from the period immediately following Dominic's ascension. Letters from Vivian Cross, then 21 years old and serving as junior ritualist under her mentor, offering condolences for his father's death and assistance with the complex magical work of stabilizing his bond to the sovereign shadow. The early letters were formal, professional, exactly what one would expect from an ambitious,
fictitious young woman seeking to prove her value during a crisis. But as the correspondence progressed, the tone shifted, became more intimate, more strategic, and Vesper found a letter dated 6 months after the assassination that made her blood run cold. Vivian wrote about the necessity of reforming the king's power structure, about how the old ways had grown stagnant and weak, about how someone with proper understanding of ritual magic could reshape the sovereign shadow's bond into something more controllable, more efficient. She referenced research into forced vessel transition, methods for separating the shadow from an unsuitable host and transferring it to someone better prepared. And Dominic had responded, his reply carefully preserved, telling her that he appreciated her theoretical insights but would not pursue methods that treated the shadow as property to be transferred at will. The correspondence ended there, replaced by more formal communications about official rituals and territorial ward maintenance. Vesper was reading this exchange for the 3rd time, committing every detail to memory, when the door opened and Vivian herself entered, moving with the confidence of someone who belonged in restricted spaces. She stopped when she saw Vesper, surprise flickering across her features before smoothing into practiced warmth. Dominic mentioned he'd given you archive access. I came to retrieve some ceremonial documents for tonight's bonding ritual. Her eyes tracked to the papers in Vesper's hands, and something sharp moved behind her golden gaze. Finding anything useful? Records of children taken from their families and assessed as potential vessels for the sovereign shadow. Vesper kept her voice level, watching for reactions. Including my brother, who was supposedly killed but was actually held for 4 years before being released into a program that no longer exists. Project Continuity was dissolved when Dominic took power. He considered it unethical, which I suppose it was, though the intention was to ensure stable power transition during emergencies. Vivian moved further into the room, her posture relaxed but her attention focused with predatory intensity. Your brother was released. If he disappeared afterward, that's unfortunate, but not uncommon for young shifters who've experienced trauma. Many choose to live as rogues rather than rejoin pack structures. You wrote to Dominic about forced vessel transition, about reshaping the king's bond. I was young and theoretical, proposing ideas without full understanding of their implications. Dominic rightfully rejected those approaches. Vivian smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Surely you don't suspect me of being involved in the current conspiracy. I've been helping investigate the bond destabilization. Vesper's magical intuition screamed wrongness, the same sensation she'd felt during their first meeting, but stronger now, and she began to stand, to put distance between herself and the ritualist, when Vivian's hand moved in a gesture too fast to track, and the air filled with ritual magic that bypassed Vesper's hybrid defenses through sheer surprise. The spell hit her like a physical blow.
not attacking but constraining, wrapping around her limbs and voice with the efficiency of something prepared well in advance, and she crashed to the floor, unable to move or cry out, when Vivian stood over her with an expression of genuine regret. "I'm sorry," the ritualist said, and the apology sounded sincere, even as she pulled additional spell components from her jacket. "I'd hoped to do this after the transition was complete, but you're too clever by half, and I can't risk you sharing your theories with Dominic before I'm ready." She worked quickly, drawing symbols on the floor around Vesper's paralyzed body, and through the haze of the constraining spell, Vesper recognized the ritual framework from her mother's grimoire, the same working her mother had died performing, blood magic designed to sever
Ever bonds. But Vivian was adapting it, changing the parameters, and with horror, Vesper understood what she was witnessing. The poisoning, the attacks, all of it has been preparation, Vivian explained as she worked, her tone almost conversational, as though she was lecturing a student rather than imprisoning someone. Dominic needs to be weakened, his bond to the shadow deteriorated, but not broken, so that when I perform the transference ritual, there's less resistance. The shadow will be desperate for a stable host, and I'll be there, prepared and compatible, ready to accept what he's been squandering through his misguided ethics. Why? Vesper managed to force the word out despite the spell, and Vivian paused in her work to meet her eyes. Because I've spent 15 years watching him waste the shadow's potential, using it to maintain a failing system rather than rebuilding from the ground up. Because I was meant to be queen, partnered with whoever became king, and he chose his guilt and trauma over the partnership that could have transformed everything. Her voice carried old bitterness beneath the rational justification. And because I discovered something he never understood. The shadow doesn't want to be a weapon of dominance. It's been resisting, growing weaker with each generation, because we've been using it wrong. But with the right host, someone who understands ritual magic and can communicate with it properly, it could be returned to its original purpose and amplified beyond anything the old kings achieved. She completed the ritual circle and stood, looking down at Vesper with something like pity. Your hybrid nature is the key to the final working. Blood magic from a witch shifter can cut the bond between Dominic and the shadow cleanly, something my ritualist magic alone couldn't achieve. That's why I orchestrated your theft attempt, fed you information about the crown through channels I knew you were monitoring, ensured you'd get far enough to be useful, but not far enough to succeed. You arranged my capture. I arranged your positioning. Dominic's decision to keep you close was his own, though it did make things more convenient. Vivian moved toward the door, her work apparently complete for now. You'll remain here, contained but alive, until I'm ready to move you to the ritual chamber. Your brother is already there, preserved in stasis as a backup vessel in case something goes wrong with the primary transition. Consider it a reunion of sorts. The door closed behind her, and Vesper was left paralyzed within the ritual circle, her mind screaming with fury and her magic straining uselessly against constraints designed by someone who understood both blood and ritual workings. Tobias was alive, had been alive and imprisoned all this time, kept as insurance for a conspiracy that stretched back to before Dominic even became king. She thought of her mother, dying to break the marks that would have made her children into vessels, and understood with terrible clarity that the protection had been incomplete, that Tobias had remained marked enough to be useful, and that Vesper's hybrid nature, the thing that had saved her from being taken, was now the thing that made her essential to the conspiracy's completion. The compulsion mark above her heart pulsed with increasing urgency, responding to her distress and likely Dominic's as well. But there was no way to reach him, no way to warn him that the threat he'd been hunting was the person he trusted most, the advisor who'd helped him survive his traumatic ascension and had been poisoning him slowly ever since. Vesper closed her eyes and reached inward, past the constraining spell and her hybrid nature and her dormant wolf, reaching for the connection she'd felt when she stabilized Dominic during the poisoning, the moment when she touched the sovereign shadow directly and felt its ancient curiosity. If bonds could be manipulated, if magic could create bridges between vessels, then perhaps she could
send a warning through the compulsion mark, use the very constraint binding her to Dominic as a path for communication. The magic required was improvisation and desperation, her blood still potent from the working she'd performed in the mountains, and she poured everything she had into the attempt, carving a message into the compulsion bond itself. Vivian, traitor, brother alive, ritual chamber. She didn't know if it would work, if such communication was even possible through a one-way binding, but it was the only chance she had, And as consciousness began to fade under the weight of magical exhaustion and the constraining spell's pressure, she held on to a single hope: that Dominic would feel the warning and understand it before Vivian completed her decade-long plan to steal the power of the Alpha King and reshape the shifter world according to her vision of perfection. Vesper woke to darkness and the smell of old stone, her body aching from prolonged immobility and her magic depleted to dangerous levels. The constraining spell had shifted, become something more complex during her unconsciousness. Silver chains wrapped around her wrists and ankles that burned with the particular cold that meant they were designed to suppress shifter abilities. She was no longer in the archive room, but somewhere deep underground, the air thick with moisture and the accumulated weight of earth above. The ritual chamber, she realized as her eyes adjusted to the dim phosphorescent light that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Ancient, predating the compound by centuries, carved from living rock and inscribed with symbols that made her magical senses recoil. This was where the original Guardian Pact had been formed, where the first Alpha Kings had bonded with the Sovereign Shadow, and the space remembered that power, held echoes of it in the stone itself. Dominic was 10 feet away, similarly chained, but conscious, his eyes tracking to her with recognition and something that looked like relief mixed with fury. The bond markings on his chest were barely visible now, faded to shadow, and she could see the separation happening, the Sovereign Shadow manifesting as a distinct presence that hovered around him like smoke given consciousness, no longer fully integrated but not yet torn free. "She has been planning this since before I became king," Dominic said, his voice rough from whatever struggle had brought him here. "Since my father's reign, positioning herself, learning the rituals, waiting for the right moment. She helped orchestrate your father's assassination." The knowledge came to Vesper with sudden certainty, pieces falling into place with horrible logic. "Created the circumstances that forced you into a traumatic ascension, made herself indispensable during your recovery, and has been slowly poisoning you ever since, waiting until you were weak enough for forced transition." Across the chamber, Vivian emerged from shadows near the far wall, her appearance immaculate despite the underground location, silver threads in her braided hair catching the phosphorescent light. "Not quite. I didn't arrange the assassination, though I recognized the opportunity it presented. Your father was killed by territorial rivals who underestimated how quickly Dominic would consolidate power. But yes, I positioned myself to be essential during the crisis, and I've spent 15 years preparing for this moment." She moved to the center of the chamber, where a circular platform rose slightly from the floor, inscribed with ritual patterns that combined multiple magical traditions into something unprecedented. Around the platform's perimeter, 3 bodies lay motionless, and with horror Vesper recognized them as the Triumvirate, the ancient shifters who were supposed to guard the king's power transition ritual. Their throats had been cut with ritual precision, their blood feeding the workings that pulsed with increasing power. "You killed the Triumvirate?" Dominic's voice carried betrayal beneath. At the anger, and Vesper understood that despite his suspicions, part of him had not wanted to believe Vivian capable of this level of treachery. They would have interfered, and their deaths provide the necessary power for a transition of this magnitude. Vivian began arranging spell components around the platform with practiced efficiency. "I regret the necessity, but transformative change requires sacrifice. They died serving the Shadow's true purpose, even if they didn't understand that purpose themselves." "This is not the Shadow's purpose," Dominic said, straining against his chains hard enough that blood began to seep from where the silver burned his skin. "It's yours, your ambition dressed up as ideological reform. And your approach has been so successful, maintaining a system that oppresses more territories than it protects, using the Shadow's power to enforce hierarchies that should have been dismantled generations ago." Vivian's voice carried genuine conviction alongside the manipulation. "I studied the original text, Dominic. The Guardian Pact was meant to protect shifter communities from external threats, not to create an internal power structure that mimics the very tyranny our ancestors fled from. Under my guidance, the Shadow can be returned to its true function and expanded, creating a network of protection across all territories, rather than centralized in a single vessel who's too guilt-ridden to use it effectively." She turned to Vesper, and her expression softened with what might have been actual regret. "Your mother understood part of this. She discovered records of the original pact and tried to warn the old king that the power was being misused. That's why she had to be silenced,
and why her children had to be neutralized as potential obstacles. She died breaking the marks that would have made us vessels, Vesper said, testing her bonds and finding them impossibly secure, designed by someone who understood exactly how hybrid magic worked. She died breaking your marks, yes, but your brother retained enough of his compatibility that I was able to preserve him when Dominic released the candidates. He's been in stasis for 8 years, held in reserve in case I needed a backup vessel or additional power source. Vivian gestured to an alcove behind the platform, and for the first time Vesper saw the preservation chamber. Crystal walls containing a figure suspended in magical suspension, features obscured by the spell but recognizably young, male, trapped in the moment before awakening. Tobias. Her brother, 21 years old now but preserved at 16, stolen and kept and used, and the rage that flooded through Vesper was hot enough to make her chains smoke despite their silver content. "You are going to release him," she said, each word carved from fury and desperation, "or I will spend whatever life I have left making sure your ritual fails in the most catastrophic way possible." "You're going to help me complete the ritual," Vivian corrected gently, "because if you don't, I'll wake your brother and kill him in front of you, before using his death as the power source instead. He's compatible enough with the shadow that his forced transition and immediate termination would provide the necessary energy, though it would be messier than using your blood magic as planned." She moved to Vesper and produced a ritual knife, the blade inscribed with symbols that predated written language. "Your mother's grimoire contained workings that can sever the bond between vessel and spirit. You'll perform that working now, cutting Dominic's connection to the shadow cleanly, so that I can establish my own bond before it seeks a new host randomly. And if I refuse, then I begin by removing your brother's fingers, one joint at a time, until you cooperate, or he's too damaged to serve as alternative power source." The threat was delivered with calm certainty, and Vesper saw in Vivian's eyes the absolute conviction that made fanatics dangerous, regardless.
Regardless of how rational their justifications. The compulsion mark above Vesper's heart pulsed with warmth that felt distant through her magical depletion, and she wondered if her desperate message had reached Dominic at all, if he'd understood it before Vivian captured him, or if they were truly alone down here with no possibility of rescue. The chamber was warded against detection, that much was clear from the magical signature she could barely perceive, and even if Felix or others searched for them, they'd never penetrate defenses that had been prepared over years. Vivian placed the ritual knife in Vesper's chained hands, the blade cold against her depleted magic, and began releasing the constraining spell just enough to allow her to work. "I'll guide you through the modifications. The basic framework is from your mother's grimoire, but we need to adapt it for the shadow's nature. Think of it as surgery, precise cutting, rather than violent severing." Dominic met Vesper's eyes across the chamber, and she saw him mouth a single word. Wait. She didn't understand what he was waiting for until she felt it. A presence reaching through the compulsion bond between them. Not Dominic, but something older. The sovereign shadow itself making contact with her directly. It had been observing since she first touched it during the poisoning, studying her hybrid nature with ancient curiosity. And now it was showing her something, a memory that was not her own. The original Guardian Pact, formed between the first shifter refugees and a protective spirit that had agreed to lend its power in exchange for partnership, mutual respect, the understanding that Guardian and Guarded were meant to work together rather than one dominating the other. Generations of corruption that transformed partnership into possession, Guardian into weapon, until the shadow itself became trapped in a role it had never been meant to serve. And beneath that history, a revelation that made Vesper's hands shake around the ritual knife. The shadow had been trying to break free for decades, subtly resisting the kings who used it for domination, and it saw in her hybrid nature a possibility, a way to transform the bond itself into something that matched the original pact's intention. "Begin the working," Vivian commanded, positioning herself at the platform center and raising her hands to activate the ritual patterns. "Cut the bond between vessel and spirit, and be precise about it. We have one chance to get this right." Vesper looked at the knife, at Dominic, who waited with exhausted trust, at her brother suspended in stasis, and at Vivian, who believed absolutely that she was doing the right thing even as she murdered and manipulated to achieve it. The shadow pressed against her consciousness with patient expectation, waiting to see what she would choose, whether she would be just another vessel seeking power, or something different, something that could break the cycle. She began the working, her blood magic rising despite depletion, because this was what she'd spent 5 years learning to do. This was her mother's legacy, and her own hybrid nature manifest. But as her magic touched the bond between Dominic and the shadow, she didn't cut. Instead, she invited, offering herself not as replacement vessel, but as second anchor point,
creating a structure that Vivian's ritual hadn't accounted for, because it had never been done before. A triad instead of a single bond, power distributed through willing connection rather than concentrated in one dominating vessel. And the shadow responded with something that felt like recognition, like relief, like finally someone understood what it had been trying to communicate for generations. Vivian's eyes widened as she felt the ritual parameters shifting, her hands moving through counterspells as she realized Vesper was not severing the bond, but transforming it. "What are you doing? That's not the working I specified. I'm creating what the Guardian Pact was always
Is meant to be," Vesper said, her voice steady despite the pain of channeling this much magic through a depleted system. Partnership instead of possession. Did you really think an ancient protective spirit wanted to be used as a tool of domination? The magic exploded outward from the platform, not violent but transformative, and Vesper felt the bond complete, felt herself become part of something larger while remaining entirely herself, felt Dominic on the other side of the connection, no longer drowning under the shadow's weight but working with it, and felt the shadow itself finally able to function as guardian rather than weapon. Vivian screamed, not in pain but in fury, and Vesper saw her force her way into the forming bond through sheer ritual power and will, trying to claim what she believed was rightfully hers, and the backlash when the shadow rejected her was immediate and catastrophic. The rejection manifested as visible force, the sovereign shadow's power expelling Vivian from the bond she tried to force her way into, and the ritualist crashed against the chamber wall with enough violence that Vesper heard bones crack. But Vivian was not simply ambitious advisor or betrayed romantic partner. She was someone who'd spent 15 years preparing for this moment, who'd studied magic that others considered forbidden, and she rose from the impact already transforming, her shift to wolf form twisted by the stolen power she'd been accumulating through her systematic poisoning of Dominic. Her wolf was larger than natural, silver-white fur crackling with ritual energy that looked wrong against shifter senses, and her eyes burned with golden fire that came from the fragments of the shadow's power she'd managed to absorb before being rejected. She'd made herself into something between vessel and parasite, and when she launched herself toward the platform where the ritual still pulsed with active magic, Vesper understood that Vivian intended to destroy what she couldn't claim. Vesper's transformation came easier now, her hybrid form emerging with the fluid grace of something finally accepted rather than suppressed, and she met Vivian's attack with claws and blood magic combined, the two of them colliding in the space above the ritual platform with enough force to send shockwaves through the ancient chamber. Behind them, Dominic strained against his silver chains, the bond markings on his chest blazing back to full visibility now that the shadow was no longer being suppressed but working with him, and Vesper felt his strength feeding into her through their newly formed connection. They fought with the savage efficiency of people who understood that losing meant death, not just for themselves but for everyone connected to the power they were defending. Vivian's magic-enhanced form was stronger, faster, but Vesper had spent 5 years surviving as a rogue against impossible odds, had learned to fight dirty and desperate, and she used every trick her mother's grimoire had taught her, every working that could give her even momentary advantage. She carved symbols in Vivian's flesh with her claws, blood magic that disrupted the ritualist's enhancement spells, and when Vivian retaliated with her own workings, ritual magic that tried to bind Vesper in place like she had in the archive room, Vesper channeled the shadow's power through their bond and burned through the constraints before they could fully form. Dominic's voice cut through the chaos, not shouting but speaking with the resonance of an alpha king whose connection to his power had been restored and transformed. "Felix, now!" The beta emerged from the chamber's entrance with 6 warriors, and Vesper realized with shock that help had been coming, that her desperate message through the compulsion bond had been received after all, that Dominic had somehow communicated with his people even while captured. Felix took in the scene with trained efficiency, the 3 dead triumvirate members, the active
Vesper ritual, Vesper and Vivian locked in combat that was demolishing sections of the ancient chamber, and he began barking orders, warriors moving to secure the space, while he approached Dominic's chains with tools designed to break silver bonds. Vivian saw her conspiracy collapsing, saw the forces she'd spent years manipulating turning against her, and her response was to accelerate toward catastrophic conclusion rather than retreat. She disengaged from Vesper and launched herself toward the alcove where Tobias remained in stasis, and Vesper understood with horror that if Vivian couldn't claim the shadow's power herself, she'd use Tobias as backup plan, force his awakening and immediate transition in a process that would burn him out completely, but provide her with the energy she needed. Vesper moved faster than she'd known she could, desperation and the shadow's power combining to give her speed that crossed the chamber in heartbeats, and she intercepted Vivian inches from the preservation chamber. They crashed together into the crystal walls, and Vesper felt them crack under the impact, felt the stasis spell beginning to destabilize, and she made a choice born from tactical assessment and desperate love. She shattered the chamber completely,
releasing her brother into consciousness and chaos rather than letting him remain trapped as potential weapon. Tobias emerged from stasis gasping, his body convulsing as 8 years of suspended animation released all at once, and the magical energy that had been maintaining his preservation exploded outward in a wave that knocked both Vesper and Vivian away from him. He was taller than Vesper remembered, no longer the 12-year-old taken from their family, but a young man of 21, though his eyes held the confusion of someone whose last clear memory was being 16 and imprisoned. Vesper reached him first, putting herself between her brother and Vivian, and felt through their blood connection that he still carried traces of the compatibility marking, enough that the shadow recognized him as potential vessel even in his disoriented state. She extended the bond she'd formed with Dominic in the shadow, offering Tobias not imprisonment but choice, a connection that would anchor him without consuming him, and felt him accepted instinctively, his magic rising to meet hers with the kind of trust that only existed between family. The bond stabilized into a new configuration, no longer triad but something more complex, a network that could potentially extend to others who chose to connect rather than being forced, and the shadow communicated its approval through sensations that bypassed language entirely. Vivian screamed again, this time with the sound of someone watching their life's work crumble, and she threw everything she had remaining into one final assault, her wolf form blazing with unstable power, as she targeted not Vesper or Tobias but Dominic, who Felix had just freed from his chains. If she could kill the Alpha King, even in his restored state, the shock might destabilize the entire newly formed bond network and give her one last chance to claim the pieces. But Dominic was no longer the poisoned, weakened vessel she'd been systematically destroying. He shifted into his alpha form with a speed that spoke to decades of combat experience, his wolf massive and dark gold with the shadow's power visible as silver-white patterns across his fur. And when he met Vivian's attack, it was with the full force of an Alpha King who'd finally stopped fighting against his own power and learned to work with it. The battle lasted seconds, brutal and final, and when it ended, Vivian lay broken in her human form, her body expelled from the transformation by the catastrophic failure of her enhancement magic. She was still alive, still conscious, but Vesper could see through her magical senses that something fundamental had burned out, the pathways that allowed her to hold and channel power, destroyed by the shadow's rejection.
Action and her own desperate overreach. Felix secured her with silver chains while the other warriors checked the triumvirate for any signs of life and found none. Dominic transformed back to human, accepting clothing from one of his people with the automatic efficiency of someone accustomed to public nudity after shifts, and moved to where Vesper stood supporting Tobias, who was trying to process everything happening around him through the fog of forced awakening. "Your message reached me just as she initiated the capture," Dominic said, his voice rough but steady. "I let her take me because I knew Felix was tracking our location, and I needed to understand the full scope of her plan before stopping it. I'm sorry you had to endure being bait. You trusted I could survive long enough for rescue?" Vesper looked at him, at the bond markings on his chest that now included silver threads matching the ones that had appeared on her own skin, visible evidence of their connection. "That's either impressive faith or terrible tactical planning." "Both, probably." He crouched to Tobias's level, his expression gentle in a way Vesper had rarely seen. "You're safe now. Your sister has been searching for you for 8 years. You're going home." Tobias looked between them, his voice hoarse from disuse when he finally spoke. "How long was I asleep? The last thing I remember clearly is being 16 and someone telling me I was being released, and then nothing until the woman in the braids put me back under, and then this." 8 years, Vesper said, her voice breaking slightly on the numbers. "She kept you in stasis as insurance. But you're awake now, and alive, and we're going to make sure you stay that way." They brought Vivian up from the ritual chamber under heavy guard, her body broken but her eyes still burning with conviction that she'd been right, that her vision had been pure even if her methods were extreme. Felix wanted to execute her immediately for the murder of the triumvirate and the attempted assassination of the Alpha King, but Dominic made a different choice, one that Vesper recognized as both justice and cruelty. "Strip her of rank and magical access," he ordered, his voice carrying the resonance of formal judgment. "Place her in the silver mines where she kept Margot Crane imprisoned. Let her live with the consequences of her actions in the same conditions she imposed on others, powerless and forgotten." Vivian's response was to laugh, bitter and broken. "You think you've won, that you've transformed the system into something better, but you're still maintaining hierarchy, still using the shadow's power to enforce your will. You've just dressed it up as partnership and called it reform." "No," Vesper said, moving to stand beside Dominic in a gesture of unity that felt natural despite everything. "We've created the foundation for actual choice. The bond network we formed can extend to any alpha who wants to participate,
who wants to access the Shadow's protective power without being forced into subservience. It's not perfect, and it will take years to implement properly, but it's a beginning. You wanted to steal power and reshape everything according to your vision. We're offering transformation that people can choose or refuse. They took Vivian away, still laughing, and Vesper wondered if the former ritualist will eventually understand the difference between her forced revolution and the gradual transformation they were attempting, or if she'd die in the silver mines, still convinced of her own righteousness. The aftermath took hours to manage, the triumvirate's bodies treated with ritual respect despite their failure to prevent the conspiracy, the chamber sealed pending investigation of what other secrets Vivian might have hidden there. Tobias was taken to medical, his body healthy from stasis, but his mind requiring careful evaluation after 8 years of lost time, and Vesper stayed with him until exhaustion made standing impossible. She woke
Sweet to find Dominic sitting in the chair by her bed, his presence steady and warm through the bond they now shared. Your brother is stable, confused and traumatized, but physically healthy. The healers think he'll make a full recovery with time and support. And your territories, the destabilized bonds? Already beginning to stabilize now that the source of interference has been eliminated. Vivian was more thorough than I'd realized, her influence extending into territories I'd thought secure. We'll be dealing with the consequences of her 15-year conspiracy for months, possibly years. He leaned forward, his amber eyes intent. But we have time now, and resources, and a new system that might actually work if we implement it carefully. Vesper sat up, feeling the silver streak in her hair that had appeared during the ritual, visible evidence of her transformation into something unprecedented. Partnership instead of domination, guardian network instead of single point of control. It sounds idealistic. It sounds like what the original pact was meant to be before generations of corruption twisted it into something else. Dominic's hand moved to his chest, tracing the bond markings that now connected him to her, and through her to Tobias, and potentially to others who chose to join the network. And we have you to thank for seeing what I'd been too trapped in the system to recognize, that the power itself wanted to change, was trying to change, and just needed someone willing to transform the structure rather than simply maintaining or destroying it. She thought about that, about coming here to steal power and destroy a system, about discovering instead that transformation was harder and more necessary than simple destruction. What happens now? Now we rebuild, carefully and with full acknowledgement that we'll make mistakes along the way. Now we offer other territories the choice to join the Guardian Network or maintain traditional bonds. Now we find all the children who are marked as potential vessels and make sure they're actually safe and free. He smiled, tired but genuine. And now you decide whether you want to be my co-advisor or my partner or something else entirely, because that bond we share means your voice carries weight equal to mine in how we move forward. Vesper considered the question, the weight of choice after so long operating in survival mode, and felt the Shadow's presence in the back of her consciousness, patient and curious about what she'd decide. She'd come seeking revenge and found belonging instead, had tried to steal power and ended up transforming it into something that served rather than dominated. Partner, she said finally. Not romantic, not yet anyway, but equal in authority and responsibility. We'll figure out the rest as we go. Dominic nodded acceptance, and through their bond, she felt his relief and hope mixing with exhaustion that matched her own. They'd survived conspiracy and betrayal, had transformed an ancient power into something new, and now they faced the harder work of implementing change in a system designed to resist it. But for the first time since her family's exile 12 years ago, Vesper felt something like hope. The reconstruction of the territory system progressed in stages measured by weeks rather than days, each change requiring negotiation with alphas who'd spent lifetimes operating under hierarchical structures and viewed transformation with suspicion that bordered on hostility. Vesper attended the first council meeting 3 weeks after Vivian's imprisonment, standing beside Dominic on the platform where Alpha Kings had traditionally held court alone, and felt the weight of scrutiny from territorial leaders who understood that her presence represented fundamental shift in power dynamics they'd considered immutable. Felix stood to Dominic's right, his position as Beta secure despite the chaos of recent events, and his introduction of Vesper carried the formal weight of official recognition.
Vesper Crane, partner to the Alpha King, architect of the new Guardian Network, recognized authority in matters of magical infrastructure and territorial bonding.
The murmur that went through the assembled alphas held notes of outrage and curiosity in equal measure, but Dominic's presence, his power no longer flickering with poisoned weakness, but steady and strong through his restored bond with the sovereign shadow, commanded enough respect that no one interrupted as he began explaining what had changed and what it meant for territories who chose to participate. The Guardian Network operates on voluntary connection rather than forced subservience, he said, his voice carrying that resonance that made weaker shifters instinctively straighten. Alphas who join the network gain access to the Shadow's protective power within their own territories, sharing the burden of defense and magical maintenance that previously fell solely to the king. In exchange, you agree to certain foundational principles: no forced marking of children as potential vessels, no use of bond magic to compel obedience from unwilling pack members, and participation in collective decision-making regarding threats that affect multiple territories. One of the older alphas, a woman named Helena who controlled the western coastal territories, stood to voice what many were clearly thinking. You're asking us to give up autonomy in exchange for shared power that we're not certain we need. The old system, for all its flaws, provided clear hierarchy and established chains of command. What you're proposing sounds like democracy, which shifters abandoned centuries ago because it proved too unstable. The old system, Vesper said, stepping forward, and feeling every eye tracked to her with varying degrees of acceptance or hostility, concentrated power in a single vessel who was slowly being crushed under the weight of maintaining bonds across 7 territories. Dominic was being poisoned for months before anyone noticed because he'd learned to hide weakness, to project strength constantly, because the system demanded it. That's not sustainable, and the conspiracy we just uncovered proves how vulnerable centralized power is to systematic manipulation. She gestured to the space around them, to the compound that had been both palace and prison. The Guardian Network distributes power, and therefore distributes risk. If one alpha is compromised, the others can compensate. If one territory faces threat beyond its capacity to handle, the network provides support. And yes, it requires giving up some autonomy, but what you gain is genuine partnership rather than performance of loyalty to someone who has no choice but to dominate you. The arguments continued for hours, some alphas intrigued by the possibility of accessing power previously reserved for the king, others resistant to change that threatened their comfortable understanding of pack hierarchy. By the end of the first meeting, 3 territories had agreed to trial participation in the network, their alphas willing to risk transformation in exchange for the protective benefits Dominic and Vesper described. The bonding ritual for those first 3 was performed in the same chamber where Vivian had tried to steal the Shadow's power, but the space had been cleansed and rededicated, the blood of the murdered triumvirate honored, and the ritual patterns redrawn according to parameters that emphasized choice and partnership. Vesper stood at one point of a pentagram, Dominic at another, and Tobias, still processing 8 years of stolen time but magically stable, at the third, while the 3 territory alphas occupied the remaining points. The working required blood from all participants, magic flowing not in hierarchical cascade from king to subjects, but in circular pattern where each person contributed equally. And when the shadow extended its presence to encompass the new bonds, Vesper felt its satisfaction, its sense of finally operating according to original design. Descend after centuries of corruption. The alphas who completed the bonding reported feeling the shadow's power as a protective presence rather than oppressive weight, and word spread through the territories with the speed of gossip and political calculation. Within 2 months, 4 more territories had requested inclusion in the network, and Dominic had to begin establishing formal protocols for evaluation and acceptance, creating bureaucracy where previously there had been only his singular authority. Tobias adjusted to consciousness with the resilience of someone who'd survived trauma by compartmentalizing it. His days split between sessions with healers who specialized in magical trauma and training with Vesper to understand the bond connection he'd accepted during chaos. He was quieter than she remembered from childhood, more careful with his words and his trust, but underneath the wariness was the brother she'd spent 12 years searching for, and gradually the distance between them began to close. They found their Aunt Margot in the silver mines, where Vivian had kept her imprisoned, her body weakened by years of silver exposure, but her mind sharp and her fury intact. Her release was public, an acknowledgement of injustice that Dominic performed with the formal weight of royal apology, and she stood before the assembled witnesses and accepted her words with grace that didn't quite mask her anger at the system that had enabled her imprisonment. Later, in private, she held both Vesper and Tobias with the fierce grip of someone who'd lost family and found them again against impossible odds. "Your mother would be proud," she said, her voice rough from disuse.
She died trying to break the system that marked you, and you've transformed it into something she might have approved of. That's better justice than revenge would have provided. The investigation into Project Continuity and the children who'd been marked as potential vessels consumed weeks of research, cross-referencing old records with current locations and tracking down young adults who'd been released years ago and disappeared into lives they'd built far from pack territories. Some were found healthy and thriving, having survived their trauma through distance and new identities. Others had died, suicide or accidents, or simply the accumulated weight of damage they couldn't process. And a few, like Tobias, had been kept in various forms of captivity by conspirators who'd recognized their potential value. Each discovery required careful intervention, healers and negotiators approaching survivors with offers of support that emphasized choice rather than obligation. And Vesper spent hours talking with people whose experiences mirrored her own family's destruction, offering the kind of understanding that could only come from shared trauma. 6 months after Vivian's imprisonment, Vesper stood on the balcony of her suite, no longer guest quarters but permanent residence reflecting her position as Dominic's partner in authority, and looked out over territories that were slowly, painfully beginning to transform. The Guardian network included 11 territories now, nearly all the major population centers, with only the most traditional holdouts maintaining old hierarchical bonds. Dominic joined her, his presence familiar now through the bond they shared, and she felt his exhaustion and satisfaction in equal measure. The southern territories are requesting network inclusion, but they want assurances about maintaining their cultural practices around pack challenges. Felix thinks we can negotiate terms that preserve their traditions while still adhering to foundational principles. Compromise and endless meetings. Very different from the absolute authority you held 6 months ago. Vesper glanced at him, noting how the bond markings on his visible skin had changed, becoming more complex and more beautiful, silver threads woven through dark patterns that represent each connection in the network. Different and better.
Childer, though there are days I miss the simplicity of just making decisions without consultation. He smiled, tired but genuine. Your hair has more silver in it than it did after the ritual. The bond is still developing. She touched the streak that had begun as single line and now threaded through her silver-white hair in multiple places, visible evidence of her connection to the shadow, and through it to dozens of other shifters. It matches your markings, subtle coordinating. Accidental fashion statement aside, how are you doing? Actually doing, not the political answer you give in council meetings. Vesper considered the question, weighing honesty against habit of deflection. I'm exhausted most days, overwhelmed by the scope of what we're trying to accomplish, terrified we'll make mistakes that cause harm we can't fix. And I'm also more certain than I've been since my family's exile that this work matters, that transformation is harder than destruction, but more necessary. That's remarkably similar to how I feel. Dominic moved closer, his hand finding hers on the railing, and the touch carried warmth that was both physical and magical. We should probably discuss the fact that we've been living in close proximity for months, working together daily, and there's something developing between us that goes beyond partnership and shared bonds. Should we? Vesper looked at him, at amber eyes with silver flecks that caught the fading sunlight, and felt her heart rate increase in ways that had nothing to do with magical connections. Or should we continue pretending we haven't noticed and maintain professional distance? I'm not particularly good at pretending, and I suspect you're not either. His thumb traced patterns on her palm, casual intimacy that felt significant despite its simplicity. But I also don't want to complicate what we've built by adding romance before we're both ready for that level of vulnerability. So we acknowledge the attraction exists and agree to revisit it when the territories aren't in states of active transformation. She felt relieved and disappointed simultaneously, practical assessment warring with emotional desire. Something like that. He squeezed her hand gently before releasing it, and she felt the loss even as she recognized the wisdom of restraint. We have time now, Vesper. That's what we've built. Space for people to make choices without compulsion. We can afford to move slowly in personal matters while we handle political ones with urgency. The first anniversary of Vesper's failed theft of the crown was marked with ceremony that she found both moving and slightly absurd. Territorial representatives gathering to celebrate the transformation of the Guardian network and the continued stability of shared power structure. Speeches were made, formal recognitions granted, and at the center of it all, Vesper stood beside Dominic and felt the weight of what they'd accomplished and what remained undone. Vivian remained imprisoned in the silver mines, reportedly spending her days in bitter silence, refusing visitors and maintaining her conviction that she'd been right,
even as her body weakened from prolonged silver exposure. Vesper had considered visiting, offering some form of closure or understanding, but Felix had advised against it, suggesting that Vivian would interpret any contact as validation or weakness, depending on her mood. Some damage couldn't be repaired, some people couldn't be saved from themselves, and learning to accept that was part of the work of transformation. Tobias attended the ceremony with Margot, both of them looking healthier than they had months ago, rebuilding their lives with the careful patience of people who understood that healing was a process rather than destination. He'd begun training as mediator, using his experience as former vessel candidate to help other survivors process their trauma, and Vesper watched him interact with refugees from the old system with pride that felt almost parental
despite their sibling relationship. As the formal ceremony concluded and people began to drift toward the reception, Felix approached Vesper with an expression that suggested professional matter rather than social conversation. The Eastern Territories are reporting unusual magical signatures near their border. Not hostile, but unfamiliar, ashes of conspiracy and corruption. But the work was never truly finished. Threats continued to emerge, and challenges required constant vigilance and adaptation. It wasn't the revenge she'd originally sought, and it wasn't the simple destruction she'd once believed would solve everything. It was something harder and more sustainable, the daily work of maintaining transformation, of choosing partnership over domination, of using power to serve rather than control. Her mother had died trying to protect her children from being used as vessels, and Vesper had honored that sacrifice by becoming a different kind of vessel entirely, one who channeled power through willing connection and distributed strength rather than hoarding it. She stood on the balcony later that night, after the ceremony and the meetings and the endless discussions about eastern border anomalies, and looked out over territories that were slowly learning to operate under new paradigms. Dominic joined her, as he often did during these quiet moments, and they stood in comfortable silence that spoke to months of shared work and growing intimacy. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked finally. "Coming here to steal the crown, ending up transforming the entire system instead?" Vesper thought about the girl she'd been 6 months ago, desperate and angry and certain that destruction was the only path to justice. She thought about her brother, alive and healing, about territories choosing to join net operating according to its original purpose as guardian rather than weapon. "I regret the years of pain that brought me here," she said slowly. "I regret that transformation required conspiracy and death and trauma. But I don't regret what we've built from those ashes. This is better than revenge would have been. Harder, messier, but better." "Agreed." His hand found hers again, and this time neither of them pulled away, comfortable with the connection and the promise of what might develop when they had space to explore it properly. "Thank you for trying to steal my power and ending up freeing it instead." Vesper laughed, the sound surprising her with its genuine amusement. "Thank you for letting me get far enough to succeed in ways I hadn't anticipated." They stood together as night deepened around them, the compound lit with magical lights that represented the network they'd built, each point of illumination a territory choosing partnership over isolation, and Vesper felt something she hadn't experienced in 12 years, the sense of belonging to something larger than survival, of building rather than destroying, of using her hybrid nature not as weapon but as bridge between different ways of being. She'd come to steal the Alpha King's power, and she'd discovered instead that true power couldn't be stolen, only transformed through willing cooperation and shared purpose. It wasn't the story she'd expected to live, but it was the one she'd helped write, and standing beside Dominic with their bond warm and steady, and their work continuing into uncertain future, she found herself grateful for the unexpected paths that had led her here, to this moment, to this beginning disguised as ending, and this partnership that promised transformation still to come.